Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce our lecturer for the evening, Gregg Pasquarelli. He's a partner in the firm Shop in New York City. I'm sure you all know his work. Shop began 19 years ago with 5 principals, as I understand it. They all went to Columbia at different times, maybe, but some overlap. I remember the first project of note is the PS1 Dunescape Pavilion, one of the earliest ones, I think. Was it first? Well, Philip Johnson kind of did one. Then these guys really set the bar. Of course, many of our faculty have done other phases of that project or competed and lost. More recently, you probably know their Barclays Center or the proposed, I call it the super thin residential tower in Manhattan. There's an interesting, if you ever go on Shop's website, it's super brief. There are 2 things I really like about your website. One is you don't show any awards at all, even though you've gotten many awards. You don't show that. You just show the work, and they are brilliant at the brevity of their mission statement. But the first line is great. Here it is, from the words of Shop. We are neither ivory tower elitists nor superficial stylists. Which I ask, why not both? But anyway. Instead, they seem to embrace the pragmatic notions of economy, construction, fabrication, digital technology, and most importantly, probably collaborative practice. They don't talk about it a lot, but a number of years ago, they were early adopters of building information technology and understanding how to leverage that towards their corrupt architectural goals, as well as developer-friendly notions of economy and efficiency. Would that be fair to say? Yeah. Again, in their words, architecture demands that design, finance, and technology work together. Another aspect of them is that they also teach. A number of the principles I know Gregg teaches. He's taught at Yale and Columbia, Syracuse, among others. And so, for me, that's a kind of interesting aspect of Shop's work. So the firm and the partners seem to have tried to combine kind of 2 worlds. One, the model of the architect educator, a kind of atelier, let's say a kind of small, innovative firm. But you have to understand their office is 200 people working in countries all over the world. So with that, maybe they would agree that they'd be the ones saying, why not both? With that, Gregg Pasquarelli, Shop.
Well, good. I have a slide to answer that, so I brought the right lecture, I guess. It's really nice to be here at SCI-Arc. 25 years ago, the first School of Architecture, when I was trying to pick where I wanted to go to school, the first one I visited was SCI-Arc in Santa Monica in the first building. And then I went to all the other schools, and the last one I visited was Columbia. And when I applied to architecture school, I only picked 2 schools to apply to, SCI-Arc and Columbia. They were the only 2 places I wanted to go. At the last second, I ended up going to Columbia, but somehow SCI-Arc has always held a really special place in my heart. And then a decade later, when we started Shop, the first school to ask us to lecture was SCI-Arc. And I think you can find that online, and you should not watch it. It's pretty bad. But anyway, it's great to see old friends. It's what did you say? My hair was much better. Yes, there was certainly more of it. But it's great to see old friends and former shoppers are here and family and everything else. And it's really nice to be in Los Angeles. I was just saying I had an allergic outbreak today, and I was, I'm like completely medicated now, but I think it was because, I'm not used to warm weather and nice people, and so suddenly I broke out. Anyway, so yeah, Shop is the name of our firm, and the name of this lecture is Never Ever Don't. And I think it came about that we were sitting around just talking about all the things that we learned in school and all the things that our wonderful, brilliant mentors had taught us, and how we sort of had a little bit of trouble following those lessons And we sort of, at almost 20 years now, we're sort of taking a step back when we were thinking about our office, our new space in New York, and, sort of like what's happened and what do we do right and what do we do wrong, and we're thinking about, what would the next 10 years be as we move into what we've been calling shop version 4.0. And there are lots of questions that we continually ask ourselves. And the way that we think about it, I think that, we want to challenge what architecture is. We love beauty, we love buildings, we love designing, we love making things, we love changing cities, but we're also equally interested in what does it mean to practice, and what is practice, and is there a way to think about practice as the sort of a very fruitful area of research for the avant-garde? Are there questions that we can ask that can really push the way in which we as architects participate in the making of space, in the making of cities, in the making of our world? And so we were talking about all the rules that we were told to follow, none of which, not all of them, but the 7 of them that we really didn't follow from our esteemed mentors. And the first one was don't have more than 2 partners. So, there's this whole idea of a new generation of practice thrives on the notion that our lives and our firms are intricate ecologies, robust in some regard and fragile in others, much like the world we are attempting to elucidate and improve. Such offices often represent affiliations across multiple partners with little but a vague understanding of where the work of one individual begins and the other ends. Ironically, the architectural blob that once held hope as the third way beyond the modern versus postmodern dichotomy has unpredictably morphed. The blob now has sparked renewed optimism, not as an architectural form for us, but rather as an organizational chart for new modes of practice that may provide a way out of the corporate versus celebrity trap. So we thought about it very, very clearly when there were 5 of us at the beginning, and we have a 6th partner, although he's been there all along in weekend crits for more than a decade and as a good friend. And I think that one of the things that was kind of interesting about the 5 of us and 6 of us now is that none of us really studied architecture as undergrads. We all had other careers before we came to architecture. And not that that was terribly important, but I think it allowed us to sort of try to freely adopt other modes of problem solving from other industries and to try and bring them to architecture itself. And this is our slide that's sort of like the quick summary of the history of architectural practice over the last 150 years. And the thing that bothered us the most, and of course you gotta remember, this is 20 years ago when we're starting to do that. I think that actually some of this rift has healed a little bit, but that separation between the kind of paper architects and the service architects, paper architects who are really pushing the boundaries in research and teaching and everything else, and the service architects who can actually execute a building at a huge scale and it won't leak. And this idea that there was an either or choice to be made was something that we were not particularly interested in. And so our whole practice from day one was about this notion of being a both and firm, that you could teach and think and explore, you could be a guardian of culture, but that didn't mean that you couldn't also execute at a very, very high level, very complicated projects with very difficult situations and politics and money, and connect to these other things actually to enable you to do the more avant-garde work. And I think that that was something that really started the firm out in the beginning. And these kinds of ideas, this was the first sort of known drawing of the universe, this idea of the complexity that has always been there in certain ways, but was really mostly invisible. And the idea of data and the way that we're now starting to see the complexity of the world and what kinds of architecture do we need to sort of insert into the urban context in order to have effects on the way in which cities operate. This is, I think these are Twitter feed points in 6 global capitals. I put Los Angeles in there just so that you could all see how dark the west side is as opposed to the east side. But I think that often we want to nail down our era, but I think that we've arrived at an era that's basically too big to nail down. And that such shared conviction may well be the death knell of the idea of the lone genius, so revered since the Enlightenment, but as an anachronism. We no longer need Superman. What we need now is the Avengers. So I think that brought us together. And I think it's something that has been the kind of research of the office, and as we've grown from a firm of first 5 people and now over 200, everyone always says to me, how big do you want shop to be someday? And I said, absolutely, I never want it to be one person over 50. And of course, it's 225 at this point. But I think it's really about a kind of culture and the way in which we think about practice and have those sort of shared goals and push the boundaries of what a young firm, now not so young anymore. I've got 6 more weeks of being a young architect, because you're a young architect until you're 50. So I'm going to use every last second of it to say I'm still young. But I think that one of the other rules that we were always told, which was sort of don't build in your own city, especially when you're a young architect. Go build, actually I think it was Frank Lloyd Wright that first said that, but something that was carried through to many, many, many of the people that we worked for and studied under. And I think that it's interesting being in New York. I mean, I think we were somewhat fortunate in having a firm that kind of started to emerge right as the city began building again and started to begin building interesting buildings. But to both be local and global at the same time is not easy, especially as a young practice. But to build in our own city is also very, very tricky, because as you can imagine, it's a difficult political forum. You can imagine people don't like giving up territory very well. It's a pretty intense place to build, really difficult zoning codes, obviously huge amounts of money at stake, hotly politically charged. And to try and experiment in that petri dish was not easy. But I think it forged a way for us to think about the city in a different way. For those of you who may be familiar, or those of you who are not, this is just a drawing that was made not by Shop, but that shows all the buildings that are approved and under construction right now in the city. So all the new ones are the beige ones. This is Vignoli's 432, and DePorts and Parks 157 West 57th Street. But the remarkable thing is there are 10 buildings planned and basically funded and under construction in New York that are taller than the Empire State Building, that will all be built in the next 5 years. So the entire skyline of the city is radically changing. And an interesting thing about our office is I tried to calculate it when I was on the plane coming out here. 60 to 70% of our projects in the office are under non-disclosure agreements. So the things that we can even talk about are things that almost happened 5 years ago, and all the things that are happening now, we're in a very, very unusual place where we can't really talk about it. But right now we have 4 commissions of buildings more than 1,000 feet tall, and to do a kind of push the envelope of a radical architecture on these multi-billion-dollar projects in this sort of cauldron is a real challenge, and has been something that's been really interesting and fruitful for us. The only one that everyone knows is a lot of people know is 57th Street, which is this one right here, which I will show later in the lecture. But we have another 1,000-foot building on the High Line, another 1,000-foot plus building in Lower Manhattan, and another one in Brooklyn, which will be by far the tallest building in Brooklyn. And some of these go up to about 1,400 feet. So it's interesting to sort of work in your home city, think about your home city, connect, and not do what I think a lot of architects tend to do, which I think is a mistake, which is to not get involved in the local politics and to really connect. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we talk this evening. So, Alberti stated that mathematics is the common ground between art and science. And for us, it's all 3 that are the basis of design. But we think that there are other things missing, and there are things that you're not typically told that you should be involved in as architects. In fact, our professional organization, the AIA, almost details it out specifically about not getting involved in means and methods, not getting involved in the finance, not taking risk. They've literally, in the past 30 years, between the legal profession and our own profession, we have marginalized ourselves as architects and taken our hands off and reduced ourselves in many ways to just the creator of an image. And for us, we think that what makes architecture really interesting is when we actually delve in and get our hands dirty and think about all these other things. And those are the things that I'd like to talk about this evening. So politics is the first one. Getting involved, and the first project that we did this on was a competition that we won to do a 2-mile esplanade along the East River waterfront. And here you had a project. This is actually the chart in master planning of all the different agencies one had to negotiate in order to get an approval. And this was just through master planning, and we won the competition here, got it through master planning, then they had a second competition, we won the competition again, and then we had to go through a completely different system of government approvals to get just through schematic design and to construction documentation. But in that process, we even went, I think I did 114 community board meetings over 4 years in order to build the consensus among 7 different neighborhoods on what should be built on a waterfront. And it was an amazing experience to actually get in there every night, night after night, talking to the people whose neighborhoods that you were going to start to affect. But at the end of the day, it really came down to having very clear communication and why they should do a project like this. I know it's a little bit light, but basically that outline there is the size of Central Park, and the 3 projects that were being conceived of at the time were Governor's Island, Brooklyn Bridge Park, and the East River waterfront. We explained to the administration, like, you've got 3 parks surrounding a harbor that's basically the same scale as Central Park. And we looked at the existing site. This is some of the only truly south-facing waterfront property in Manhattan, about 5-minute walk from the 3rd largest central business district in the country, the Wall Street area. Yet this is how this area was being used. There was infrastructure, places where the sidewalk got down to only 14 inches wide. There was an elevated highway through the middle, which you can see here, the FDR Drive. They were using it for garbage dumps, salt piles. These beautiful 18th century squares were used as parking lots. There were even places where here you have housing projects, very little open space available, and there were places where there were up to 14 layers of chain link fence blocking off people from the waterfront. And so there had been, over the previous 50 years, many proposals of doing something with this waterfront, none of which ever got built by phenomenal architects. And our whole thing was, instead of thinking about an object that got stuck on the side of Manhattan, think about the cross-grain connections between the 7 different neighborhoods out to the water. And we leased a helicopter and had them fly us over the 300 miles of waterfront property in New York to develop a taxonomy of performance criteria of how the New York waterfront functions, and came up with the 2 that were most similar to what we wanted to do on the East River waterfront. And the existing condition was basically a kind of functioning main street here, a service street here, an elevated highway here, layers of chain link fence, sheds on the piers that you couldn't get to, and parking lots underneath. And what we ended up finding out was the main reason that people weren't going out and using the waterfront was the distance between these 2 curbs, which varied between 120 and 200 feet wide, with no signals underneath the highway. Nobody wanted to go. So we said to the city, well, that's weird that didn't show up. Oh well. We said, look, get rid of the parking, wherever you get rid of the fences, narrow the sides of the street, wherever you can, build piers. Instead of thinking of the overhead highway as a problem, start building pavilions underneath it so that you bring program onto the waterfront. And whenever you can, try and make double-decker piers to maximize the amount of space. And so this was then, a lot of it was on platforms. We built up the soils. We used precast concrete walls to hold the soils in. We calculated where the sun would come to push the trees as far under the elevated highway as possible. And it's being built now in 7 different phases. We're through phase 3. But you could see what the park starts to look like. We tried to get them to take down the FDR Drive like they did at the Embarcadero, but we weren't able to do that for a myriad of reasons. And so what we did do is we painted the main girder lavender and hid the lighting up inside the structure itself. And like, one of the things that we felt was really important, one of the great things about going to waterfront, especially at dusk, is it has to be lit enough that you you feel safe and comfortable, but you don't want the brightness in your eyes. You want to be able to sort of get down there, turn down the levels, see the boat, see the lights out on the harbor. And so all the lighting in the entire project is buried inside the elements and bounces off a material. And by having this, this light hit this lavender, it really kind of creates this amazing mood on the Esplanade as you go down. It's extremely romantic. I guarantee you will make out with anyone who you go down there with, but it worked. And other things that we did, really small elements. Like one of the things that I think is so difficult about being on a waterfront park is the 42-inch railing is exactly where, when you sit in the bench, it blocks your view of the water. So it took us 4 years, but we proposed that all the seating along the edge would be bar stool height, and the railings expanded up to 18 inches in order for people to sit. You can flip open your laptop, you can read the paper, you can have lunch. They're the most used seats in the park at all times, and now it's a policy in the city to start building only bar stool height seats at waterfront around the entire city. But from this picture is taken almost exactly where that truck and garbage dump was. And so you could see the sort of effect it's had on the neighborhood. And then here you see it at night. Some of the pavilions that are being built underneath the drive, these are restaurants and community spaces. And then there was a great pier that we got to look at. And so the pier had been demolished, but we kept the permit open. Once a pier is demolished, you can't rebuild it for environmental reasons. So we only had the footprint of the pier that we could shade in the river. But we wanted to expand it. So you have two ways to expand it. Try and get it approved to make a bigger pier, but now you have to double the number of piles you're putting into the river, or make a double-decker pier where the sort of program elements become these sort of glass boxes that hold the upper level of the pier in place, and then plant a green roof on top of them so that you have lawns to sit on. And so then we then sort of made the underbelly of this a kind of sculptural element, and the pier got built. So you have these two glass box programs that literally structurally hold up the upper deck, and then you've got this kind of big red belly of recycled plastics with marine lighting behind it that float above. But here you could see the park pier as it got finished. And I mean, it was remarkably inexpensive to build this space. So where other elevated parks are in the $600, $700, $800 a foot range, we built this for about $150 a foot. And it's incredibly well used. With amphitheater seating, looking at the historic ships, these are the green roofs from the pavilions below. And then looking back at the first phase of the project. And so that was a really interesting thing to really get involved in the politics to do it. And in the center of this whole project was one privately held area. Most of it was public space, but there was a zone that had been leased to the Rouse Corporation, who did Faneuil Hall and those other festival marketplaces of the 80s. But it had been a failure most of its time in existence in New York. And so they said, hey, we love what you're doing on the Esplanade. What would you do if you got control of the whole Seaport neighborhood? So this is what it was existing. This was the Ben Thompson sort of shopping mall from the 80s. These were the old fish market buildings. This is actually a landmark building, the Tin Building. And then this is the sort of historic neighborhood on the other side of the FDR Drive. And so we said, look, I think no one today would build a 3-story enclosed vertical shopping building on a waterfront at this point. And so that the first thing we wanted to do is that everyone comes down here and they want to look and see the Brooklyn Bridge. So what if we carve open the building to allow views of the pavilions of the bridge? What if we extend the street grid of Manhattan out so that literally the grid comes out onto the pier? And what if we look at the scale and sizes of the retail shops and replicate them out so it really feels like a continuation of the neighborhood? And so this was kind of the existing condition, and then this is the proposed condition where the street comes out, a new tower here, a new Pier 17 building, a marina to the north, a restored Tin Building as a food market, and then other restorations to parts of the site around, and the pavilions that continue over here. This is the Pier 15, the one with the sort of red ceiling just to the south. And sectionally, the problem was that now the FEMA maps after Sandy went up, So we've got to lift these buildings out of the floodplain. And so the idea was to take down the Ben Thompson building, lift the entire pier up, push the tin building back and rebuild it so that the Esplanade could go through, and float the large floor plates above, make it a flat roof so you now have a 60,000 square foot park on the roof, and make a continuous series of smaller blocks that would become retail and food and beverage that sort of make this network as you go out. So as you build it up, you see the boxes that stack, and then the large open space on the roof. So this was the existing condition, and the first phase got approved for this Pier 17 building, which sort of really looked at the morphology of the New York piers with large glass doors that go up and down so that you can block it off in the winter. It's got this kind of big crenellated channel glass system, and then this sort of network of streets and boats can actually pull right in, and then an 1.5 acre rooftop element here. But really opening up the whole structure to the bridge, programming the roof at night, and then taking the current neighborhood as it sits and really opening it up with bike lanes and the Esplanade and getting a double-sided retail street, hanging these sort of new light elements from the top. This is the current condition, looking at the tin building, sliding it back and restoring it for a great food hall. This is what it looked like just about 6 months ago, but then what the new building, this is under construction right now, will look like when it's done. And the Esplanade. And then basically there's one tower, which is super controversial. We're in the middle of a big battle on it right now. But we looked at a lot of sort of morphology and making of boats and sails. This is a shop project that we had done a while ago, so this notion of a sort of taut metal skin and these sort of inset wood boxes. And we thought about inscribing the building that way as it folds up. And then basically this is the big revenue generator that pays for everything else that you want to get done. So this is really, it's doing like 6 blocks of the city, and we're in the middle of the process of doing it, and the political battle is a remarkable one. It's a tough one, and it's one that, quite frankly, I don't know we're going to win. But we think it's the right thing to do for the city, and it's an interesting thing to watch it unfold. Rule number 3 is don't work with developers. You know, it's a very interesting process, and for us, another critical thing that architects need to know something about, and you don't have to be a banker, but you do need to be conversant in what the terminology is and how your buildings get financed, because if you don't, you will not get them built. And the fact of the matter is, it's not that hard. You know, business school is basically 60 vocabulary words and using Excel really well, so you can all learn it. Don't be intimidated by it. But really, early in our career, one of the first ways that we got to experiment and do a project of, you know, that was way bigger than we could as a young firm was a building called the Porter House, where we, this is what it looks like today. But basically, we found a warehouse. There were a lot of people chasing that piece of property. And the first thing we thought of was buying the air rights from the buildings next door. It was fully built out on its FAR, transferring them up. And there was a height limit and a setback requirement, so there's only so much you could push up there. And a few less people had that idea. And then we said, look, if we could cantilever it out, we could use more of the air rights and therefore generate a little bit more projected income and therefore bid a little bit more for the property so that we could get control of it. But the critical thing was when we figured out how to make this 2-story Vierendeel truss and putting a new structural element in the center of the building that actually holds it. These piles are actually in tension on one side and compression on the other side. Because then very inexpensively we were able to push the cantilever out as far as we could. There's a sort of law of diminishing return economically as you push the cantilever out, but we were able to overcome that. That allowed us to just get a few more square feet that we would build, which would generate a little bit more revenue, which allowed us to offer just a little bit more on the site, and we ended up getting control of it. And what we did was we put the deal together. We teamed with one of our clients, Jeffrey Brown, and took an equity position in the building and said that we would design it and build it and sell it. And so we had never worked with a metal facade before. and we said that the new volume should look nothing like the historic volume whatsoever. And we wanted to do this kind of random pattern of zinc panels. And what we did was, this was the first time that we had modeled everything. This was in SolidWorks, actually. But it was 430 different pieces, 4,000 pieces in total. And we modeled, there were sort of 22 protoforms. And we actually went to the contractors and said, how much would a zinc facade be? And they said, well, you know, it's about $70 a foot instead of a metal one, which is $40 a foot. And we said, but that's why. The raw material is only half of the cost, and zinc only cost about 10% more than steel. Why would it be so much more? And they said, because we don't want to do it. And if you want to do something esoteric, you architect, you're going to pay through the nose for it. So we said, well, where do you get the zinc? And they said, well, most zinc comes from France or Belgium. So we went to France and we bought 1,000 pieces of 1 meter by 3 meter zinc, and we brought it back to New York. And what we did was we designed the entire building around unfolding the panels, 1 on a piece, 2 on a piece, or 3 on a piece. And we used SolidWorks for the first time, so there were no shop drawings, 4,000 different panels. Everyone was cut, everyone was coded, which was the instruction set for putting the building together. The 4,000 panels were delivered. We started on one corner, went all the way around, and when we got finished, we were 1/32 of an inch off with no shop drawings whatsoever. Also, brought it in at $43 a square foot compared to the $70 that was bid. And 11 years later, this rain screen system has never leaked. The only thing that's ever leaked in the building is the historic brick part. But it was a remarkable thing, because what it did was it made the building an icon. It did not cost any more. We took on the risk to get it done, and yet we sold for 17% more than our 3 competitors, other well-known architects at the time, because of the design. And it was the first time we had real metrics that design was not a cost center, but could be a profit center and could make a beautiful building. And so the apartment sold right away. And one of my favorite parts of this building, I think, is the sort of depth of the glass to the zinc, and makes this real great play of light and shadow. These are light boxes that light up at night. The windows are here. But of course, pushing the glass back creates these ledges. And ledges are a problem because we have pigeon issues in New York City. And so we called the Museum of Natural History and asked, was there an angle of repose that a pigeon would not like to land on? And they said, yes, it's 33 degrees. And so from the drawing set, we actually put a 33-degree angle here. And literally, this was in the CDs, the pigeon falling off here. But the pigeons land, and they hit that, and they fly right off. And it's remarkable because whatever it is now, 12 years later, there's not one pigeon turd on the facade of the building at all. And then you see how the building turns from day to night. And we did all the collateral materials and sold the project. And doing that, I mean, it was an amazing thing. I mean, a lot of our colleagues said, you know, you got to watch out. You're getting in bed with the developer. This, you know, you've got a kind of great reputation. This is a slippery slope to hell. You know, you guys are going to lose all your street cred. And what we learned, it was actually Bernard Tschumi, who, I mean, I was terrified. And I went to Bernard and I said, like, what should we, my dean at the time, and I said, what should we do? And he said, oh, you know, you should definitely do it. And he's like, don't you know that Loos developed? And he started listing all the guys who had developed to fund their architecture careers. And what we found out, though, and this is the one lesson I'd like you to take from it, especially as a group of young architects, was what actually happened was the exact opposite. The second we were aligned in our desires with the financial partners, we got complete design freedom. Once they thought that our goal wasn't to spend as much of their money to get on the cover of a magazine, but to make something of quality that would last, that would both, and we told them where to invest and where not to invest, but to make something that was really good, that had an impact, but could also generate revenue, we got complete freedom. And that was a huge lesson for us. And the other thing was that we were willing to take on the risk of that wall. And there's no way any typical, if we weren't an owner, there's no way they would have given us the shot to do that. And so by taking on that risk, by understanding what the client did, by getting involved in the financial side of things, it actually gave us artistic freedom. and something that we're really proud of. Now, there are other larger scale projects like the Domino Sugar Factory that we're doing. So this is a 3.3 million square foot project in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. A project originally designed by Raphael Vignoli's office, superb architect, and was working with a particular client to come up with a particular solution. But the site has unbelievable views both up the river, down the river, and back into Brooklyn and towards downtown Brooklyn. And it's almost a quarter-mile long. And the original plan really was for a series of 5 towers and 1 inland building that sat on a new park where these became cul-de-sacs with stairs down to the park. And the client lost the project just had to sell the project and sell the site, sold it to a new owner, the Walentises, who are the family that really developed Dumbo, the whole neighborhood of Dumbo in Brooklyn. And they came to us and they said, why would we go back? This went through a very critical and difficult approvals process. And they said, tell us why we should bring it through an approvals process again. And so the first thing we looked at was we said, well, the first thing we would do is we would bring this street all the way through, because you don't want the buildings facing directly on the park, because then it completely privatizes the park. And that's a suburban move, and that's not what we want to do here. We want to make this public. And we said the second thing is we wouldn't build a building on this site at all. We'd move all that FAR onto the other sites so that every building is waterfront and that you both have a kind of green public space on the water and an urban plaza in the middle of your project. And then we looked at it and we said, and instead of having an arbitrary height limit, which was what everyone is trying to do, especially in the boroughs, we said, look, first of all, push the buildings back so that the street can go through. Make them significantly taller, because you have to move the FAR from here onto the other sites. But when you do so, build every building so it has like a huge hole in it, so that when the sun comes across, and then we did a whole series of studies that actually showed the taller buildings with the holes allowed more light into the neighboring community than the shorter, wider buildings. And bring that street through and put a 50% increase in the public space. And look at the stuff that's getting built over there right now, which is not very interesting. And we said, convince the community that they should break the skyline height limit. And we said, what we love about skylines is their difference and variation. And if you had a height limit in Manhattan, for example, look how shitty the skyline looks when everything's the same. So we said, instead of doing this original plan, let us make the buildings 50% taller, put the big cuts and holes in them, and let's see what it could be. So now these facades are purely placeholder facades. It's not what we designed. We were the master planners. And Shop is doing this building right now and will do this building. Buyer Blinder Bell is doing this building because it's a historic renovation. And then these 2 buildings they are going to interview, and we insisted that they go with other architects to bring it in. So those will come online in the next year or 2. We do not want a quarter mile of shop buildings lined up on the river. I don't think it's good for the city. But these buildings are quite extraordinary. And the fascinating thing was the community, which is always fighting against height, unanimously supported this proposal. They understood, because we were able to clearly articulate what the issues were, the community got behind this. And not only that, when they did the rezoning, which is usually just for a series of parameters, they actually said, we want to make sure the buildings have the giant donut holes in them. We want to make sure that they're this tall, and they wrote into the legislation that that's what the buildings had to be. So it was kind of remarkable, and the way that the section works is it's really just 2 slab towers with 2 6-story bridges going across. Not so different than Malson's project out here with that big sort of thickened bridge. But again, getting 50% more space. We're working with James Corner Field Operations on all the public space. We're taking parts of the sugar refinery and turning them into the sculptures in the park. But then to get a sense of what it might be like there, and the project got approved and is moving forward at a rapid pace. So it's kind of remarkable, and it's not all residential. It has hotels, it has office space, parks, community facilities, museums, and residential. Another thing we were told is don't be nice. We said, we thought about that from day one, about what is our responsibility of running a firm and the kinds of buildings that we're going to put out in the world. And, what is the environment and what is the culture of the office? And actually, one of the things that we work the hardest on is what the culture is in the office. What does it feel like to be there every day? What do we do together? And it's a really important part of the office. There are big firms in New York, really well-known firms, that use this formula in order to pay their workers $16,000 a year, because they can get around the labor law by saying that's what the minimum wage is, and this is how many hours you're going to work, and this is what we can pay you, which we think is atrocious and not right, and something that we've never believed in. And Shop has never had an unpaid intern in the history of the firm. Every single employee has full health insurance paid for by the firm entirely. Every designer has access to the partners. We will not work for dictators. We will not work in countries that use indentured servants for their labor. And we transfer knowledge wherever we go. And those are really important parts about what we think about it means to be an architect and to do it in the right way. And it can be done. Don't take that bullshit that you can't afford to do it. You can do it if you're smart about how you do it. And so working for a company that also says don't be evil, we did a really amazing research project for them where we looked at, they wanted a net zero office building in Mountain View, which is pretty tough when every single person has two 42-inch vertically mounted screens for coding on their desk. But it was about this kind of system, or a kind of almost a motherboard of a building, that different kinds of technologies could be tested out on the building itself. And we wrote code for them that talked about the 10 things that they wanted, but if they changed the priority of what they wanted, how the morphology of the building would change. And it was the way that they then understood architecture was by the code, not necessarily by the form. It was a fascinating process. And we talked about how the neighborhoods could work, how different things connected together based on the organization and the circulation at the building level, on each floor with different departments in these different neighborhoods that we developed. And the building ended up becoming this kind of large performance wing about how they wanted their offices to be. And this was the proposed building, which we were really excited about. And this was a project that got put on hold in the financial crash in 2008 and 9. But we learned so much from this building that soon after that there was a competition that was an international competition to do a government complex in Botswana, Africa, and which we entered. And it was fascinating because the program was almost exactly the same. And so we took everything that we had learned in 2 years of the Google project, and then we just flipped it and put the sun in the other hemisphere and actually took that and connected it to the sort of two main physical elements of Botswana, which are the dunes and the deltas, and came up with this idea of taking the Google project and slicing it up. We kept forgetting the sun was in the other side, so it took us a while to get that right. But then ended up with this kind of system for a project of these series of bars that could be added to, with these connecting bridges, with these performative gardens that operate in the middle. And then one of the key things is that all of the, you have to shade the cars in Botswana, so they usually build these giant tents all over to protect the cars from the sunshine. And we said, look, just park the cars on grade and we'll berm up the land. And then so it's really an on-grade parking garage, but looks like it's underground. But the key reason was there were these incredible 150-year-old trees all over the site. We said, we'll literally build the building around the trees, and the parking will be on grade, and the gardens will be kind of on the second floor, if you will. And so these become the indoor-outdoor spaces where the trees come up from the parking, and then the bridges connect through the treetops. So as you walk between the buildings, you're walking through the treetops themselves. And then the building almost sits as this kind of arc. Here you could see the sort of bermed up land, the cars drive in underneath, and it floats above the landscape itself. And It would be the largest green roof in Africa. Here you see the whole complex. So we were fortunate enough to win the competition and started working on the project. And then looked at lots of different ideas for how the main public interior spaces would be built. So we really looked at different tiling methods, and we looked at traditional basket weaving techniques, and came up with one that we really like. So then these become the sort of spaces on the inside, and it's all milled local wood, locally harvested wood. We've got 5-axis mills down there working on the facade system, the interior facades, the interior walls, which actually double with lighting and the HVAC systems inside the building. You can see these are some of the latest renderings, and this project is under construction right now. It's about a 400,000 foot complex in the capital of Gaborone, and it's basically seeding their high-tech industry. So when you get out of the airport in the capital, on the left is the Diamond Exchange, and on the right will be this building, which they see as the sort of symbol of what's happening. And we've connected with the university down there. We've done training in BIM and CNC fabrication. We've got an educational program for young architects to learn how to do this, and we're training some of the contractors on how to build in these ways. And it's been a really amazing and rewarding experience. So we hope it'll be done in about a year. Another thing that we were told often was don't talk about beauty. And, you know, I mean, I think that it's a strange thing, and sometimes I do have trouble with this rule because it just seems sometimes unnatural, but at other times just really incredibly important. And if we're not thinking about beauty and exploration and theory, then none of the other technical sides matter. You've got to have both all the time. And, you know, in a way, for us, beauty is really sort of the fingerprint of the human experience on the world and is really important to everything. And so I can't really talk about them, but right now we're working on 3 museums. This is the only one I can even show any images of, but a fascinating project where it's 3 different museums wrapped into one large civic building. And the problem was the idea that how do you have sort of the civic and the 3 museums, but you have them together, but one couldn't take prominence over the other 3. So how do you organize that? So the idea that we had was that if you twist them around each other and then chop them off by the zoning envelope of the block, no one can tell which museum has any prominence, and that they all sort of get a kind of equal connection. But yet then the lower floor, this all floats on the second floor, the ground floor was really about a kind of urban campus with different elements like markets and music and this kind of big civic room and a kind of shopping room, and these all connect to the other streets in this area. This is literally in the center of an American city that's going through a renaissance right now, and the client owns about 40 to 50 buildings in downtown and is making this building as a sort of catalyst for the entire neighborhood. And so you see the section, there's a kind of large public amphitheater space with a huge glass wall that opens up, and in the warm weather will completely open up to, which is going to be a new light rail system here, and there's another park and quad here, and the retail is here, and then these are publicly open spaces as you move through between the other blocks of the downtown. And then the upper level becomes this kind of big event space and the entry for all the museums. And then you see as they go up, and there's a conference center and hotel support area on this side. And then the building has a kind of large skylight that sort of mirrors the cross. But this was a project that was really done almost entirely in model form. We just started pushing and pulling, and we did the diagrams, and then we built the model. All models at CHOP are done in-house. We see building the model as an absolute integral part of design in and of itself. You know, I've always thought it's really true. You know when you're like gluing two pieces of wood together and it's like 3 in the morning and you've got the review the next day and the glue won't hold and you're exhausted and you can't get them to stick? That's the same exact spot. The contractor can't get the two pieces of steel to come together when they're building the building. And so by actually building the model, I think it's almost prototyping what happens in the field, and you can start thinking like, well, if I had a hard time building the model there, the contractor's gonna have a problem. Let me think if I can solve that problem for them now so we can get it built. But this is the building as it currently stands. It was finally greenlit this week. And so we're gonna move, this was just the concept phase. We're gonna move into schematic design probably by the end of the month. And the whole idea is this is a kind of ceramic tile facade with these kind of glass bridges between the different elements. This is the conference center with a series of lecture halls that sort of cascade down this large slope. And some early renderings of the sort of main public space and the way that that looks out onto the main avenue in the city. And then you see the bridges that connect through, so you can go through each museum, you know, as a spiral, or you can go through all the museums not in sequence. And then just how that space could be used at other times, and looking at the building itself. So we're really excited about this stuff. And like we said, we're working on the Andy Warhol Museum that's going to be going into New York. It's a branch of the Pittsburgh Museum. And it's really fun to be thinking about projects like this and thinking about the sort of hardcore technical, political, financial projects at the same time. And it's that friction and that coherence, I think, that really drives us and excites us every day. So another rule 6, don't get involved in means and methods. This is squarely in your AIA documentation, and I strongly encourage you all to completely ignore that. Because if you actually want to innovate, this is the place to innovate. And you know, there's been such a paradigm shift in the last decade. You know, it's a really good time to think about the way that technology is changing so quickly that you've got opportunities to push the way buildings get made more so than we maybe have as architects in 100 years. And so, you know, there's always been sort of complex forms and ways of making buildings. It's always changed as new materials were developed, new aesthetics emerged out of it. But it's always this idea of like the making and the assembly and the fabrication relative to the ornament that we think is really important. And it's about that thickness between them. And getting involved in how it gets made means that some jerk contractor or out there doesn't value engineer your designs away. But when you don't take responsibility for it, then you don't know what's gonna happen. And so the more you get involved in the way it gets built, the more we think you can get your avant-garde or really interesting designs that you care about done. And for us, what we learned, a lot of it was what were the kinds of drawings that you had to make. That plan, section, and elevation maybe weren't necessarily the best ways for us to sort of communicate what we want to do with buildings. So as we said, technology is critical, and getting involved in the technology and how it can be used really can make all the difference. And so that brings us to the Barclays Center. And so some of you, I'm sure, may know that this was originally a Frank Gehry project. So this was the original design with a basketball stadium in the center of 4 towers on a large block in downtown Brooklyn. I think an absolutely brilliant design in the sense that for an urban arena, arenas tend to sort of be like, it's like this sort of giant nuclear reactor in the middle of a parking lot that's like dead all the time if there isn't a game going on. And I think that Frank brilliantly kind of buried the building in the base of the towers. Now, what happened was the press often tries to say that the Gehry building was too expensive, but that's not true at all. It was a brilliant design and it was really smart. The problem that happened was the crash of 2008, and they were trying to build this in 2009, was that the design was basically these 4 towers with a big foundation that held the bowl of the arena in the middle. And the problem was that you couldn't finance the 4 towers in 2009. And so that and the client loved Frank and loved his designs, but the problem was they would have to start from scratch in order to build it. And if this was in March or April or May of 2009, and the problem was that it would take obviously at least 18 months to redesign the arena, but the tax laws in the United States were changing. And if you didn't have your building in the ground by December 31st, 2009, stadium bond financing was no longer tax deductible, and this would have been a $400 million hit to the project. So the client, unfortunately, had to figure out, how do I redesign a stadium and get it built in 7 months? And what they did was they went to a design-build contractor, Hunt Construction, and this is Forest City Ratner Companies, who have been an amazing client to work with. And they said, how do we get something built? And they said, the only way you can really do it is, let's look at the dozen NBA arenas that we've built, and if you like one and it fits on the site, we've got the steel drawings, we can order the steel tomorrow, and you have a shot at getting in by the end of the year. So they ended up picking the Conseco Fieldhouse from Indianapolis, which remarkably fit on the site. And then this was the building, which was an Ellerbe Beckett, now AECOM design. And the city felt like it had been a little bit baited and switched, and it really wasn't Ellerbe Beckett or AECOM's fault, because they were told to just copy that and put it there. And so it became a very difficult situation for all involved. The client came to us and they said, can you help us and fix the project? And when we realized that the steel had been ordered and that it was basically just a skin job on the project, we actually turned it down. And we said that we don't do that, and good luck, and we wish you the best. And we had a great meeting that went on 3 or 4 hours, and they said, we'll call you when the recession's over. And that's where it left. But then that night with my partners, we came up with one idea, which was to take that block of the steel, and we said, if we could take apart, let's say 10 or 15% of the steel, we might be able to reorient the building from this kind of vertical, traditional field house box to something that we think is more of the right kind of sort of urban machine for the area. So we thought about it on 3 levels, that there would be a series of bands. By aligning the concourse inside with the sidewalk on the outside, you got a sort of band that related at the sort of human scale. And then a second band would relate at the sort of brownstone scale. And then the third band would be the sort of object that's seen on the city skyline. And so we said, if you can open up the views, you can puncture the entries, you can put as many retail stores that open up to the street when the game isn't on, and then flip to open up to the concourses when the game is on, you have something that no longer is this kind of big dead object in the city. And we said, finally, on this acre-big plaza in the front, there needed to be a kind of big civic gesture. And we proposed putting this super large canopy out in the front. We called it sort of the Arms of Bernini, but hip-hop style, and proposed putting a large Oculus in the middle. And the concept here was that, so this is a stadium for 19,000 or 18,000 people, not one parking spot built for the stadium. And the idea was, we extended and put a new subway entrance right in the plaza, and it's kind of remarkable because it's really the first sports facility in the country that prioritizes people who arrive by public transportation over those who arrive by private transportation. And as a result, more than 85% of the people going to the arena come by public transportation. And so there hasn't been the whole disaster of the traffic, Carmageddon is what they called it, proposing today. And so the idea is that as you come out of the subway, you look right through the Oculus at the upper ring. And then we carved out a big part of the stadium so that from the public plaza, you can see right into the scoreboard and the bowl itself. And again, we did dozens and dozens of different shapes of the bands, and actually set up camera angles from every place that you would see it, and pushed and pulled the bands until we could get the lowest number of differentiated panels, but still keep the aesthetics of the building. And so it's kind of hard to see the unfolds here. It was 12,000 different shaped panels of basically a Core-10 steel. And then we took on the role of actually producing the fabrication tickets, of detailing it. And these 12,000, no two were alike. They were cut, with the plasma cutter. They set up a factory where the panels were hung on these sort of dry cleaner racks. We collected rainwater on the roof and put them through 15 wet-dry cycles a day for 4 months, which put a 10-year patina of rust on the panels. Each panel was tagged and numbered. We wrote our own iPhone app that could track every panel from the manufacturer to the weathering, to the delivery, to the mega panels they were on, to where they were between the factory and Brooklyn, and had the instruction set for how they could get put onto the building. And so it was 12,000 individual panels connected into 900 mega panels, which were exactly the size of a truck that could get into New York City and get the panels up. And they went up. And so now, in this kind of Brooklyn landscape, you see the building as it sits there. This is looking up Flatbush Avenue. And then here you see the Oculus. And one of my favorite parts of the building is that we proposed putting all the digital board on the inner ring of the Oculus so it doesn't blare out into the neighborhood, which as you come up through from the subway or lining up to go in the main entry, it really creates this incredible dynamic presence. This is about an 85-foot by 200-foot canopy. Here you see as you come, this is sort of coming in the front door, you can see the scoreboard, you can see the bowl. And the interiors, we were kind of thinking of sort of like the wet Brooklyn night, where the ribs that hold the steel came in to become the light elements. And then we have everything we wanted as dark as you can make it. And you have Brooklyn-only restaurants are all the concessions. We inserted some different materials in these boxes to break it up. We went back to PS1, our PS1 project for all the beer distributors, which was fun. And then finally, I think one of the most important parts is we all love theater, we all love art, we all love sports. And we said, the reason we love sports is that sports is theater with an unscripted ending. And that's what makes it exciting. You don't know how it's going to end. And so we said the whole place should feel like a black box theater. So we did all the seats in black. We did all the concrete in charcoal gray. We convinced them to change their uniforms from red, white, and blue to black and white. We said if you ever want New Yorkers to buy it, it better be black. They looked at us like we were crazy, and then Jay-Z was like, no, that's actually kind of a good idea. And then they were like, oh, it's a great idea. So, and they went from 26th in sales of merchandise to number 5 in sales and merchandise in 1 year. And so, it was an amazing experience to do that project, and we're very proud. And I want to make it very clear, I should have said this before, we did call Frank and ask for permission before we took the commission, and would not have taken it if he weren't okay with it. But he was working on multiple projects with them and was very supportive. But it was a really fun and stressful thing. I'll add one last thing before I show the last project of the night, which is when we finally showed them the design that we wanted to do, we were given 7 weeks to redesign the entire arena, detail it, and cost it. And we had a delta that we had to come within in order to do it. And we said if we did it, we wanted the whole project. And they said go for it, and we were able to do it. I never want to have a summer like that again. But it was an amazing experience. So the last rule, kind of don't try to do it all. Be a specialist, not a generalist. And I think that's exactly what you should not do. I think that actually what we are as architects, what makes us interesting and what makes us different from everybody else, is that we know a lot about a lot of different things, that we are generalists, but yet for some reason they keep trying to the AIA especially keeps trying to push us into being specialists. And as we've given away those territories to developers, to contractors, to construction managers, to project managers, to different engineers, to fabricators, we've lost what made us really special. And I believe that what we need to do as a profession is gain those territories back by taking the risks and taking on all the things that we've been talking about today. We try to do as many different things in shop as possible. In fact, we've actually just raised our first, we're very close to raising our first tranche of funding for for our first software product. But I think that getting involved in as many things as you can, that's what we're good at. And don't be specialists, be generalists. It's the last great generalist profession. And the more specialists we become, I believe the more irrelevant we are and the less power we have and the less we have a seat at the table. Because people want people that can think about, have expertise in multiple things and can bring them together to solve problems, not sit in their corner and say, this is the only thing I stand for and I'm just gonna fight for that. So bringing all those together to us is what architecture is. And the last project I'm gonna show is the super skinny building on 57th Street, which is now under construction, which is a remarkable structure. It is 1,420 feet high and 60 feet wide. So a slender building, like a typical skyscraper is 10-to-1 slenderness ratio. Anything over 13-to-1 is considered slender. Some of the most slender buildings in the world in Hong Kong are 17, 18, 19-to-1. This building is 23-to-1 and is really quite extraordinary technically. But we thought about the history of the city and this notion of the sort of tall over the short. We thought about the buildings that New Yorkers love. And of course, they were all office buildings, but this was pre-air conditioning, so it was about their proportion, about their slenderness, and the way that they engaged that. And so you did have the sort of slender historic towers that sat on the skyline, but of course, with air conditioning and efficiency and post-war economics, the buildings went for much larger floor plates and became these boxes. But for some of you who may know or not know, there is this phenomena happening in the city right now with these super tall, super luxury buildings on the 57th Street corridor, which is due mostly to an anomaly in the zoning and because the value of the apartments with views of Central Park have gone so exponentially high, it actually pays to build these highly esoteric buildings. So we're in a moment right now where it's a period and it's only gonna last a few years because all the air rights are being bought up. So there are only going to be about a half a dozen of these, and then it's over. And so there's going to be this kind of new moment of the super tall buildings, but they're residential, not commercial. And so you can see the sort of comparative floor plate sizes, and our Steinway building is 60 by 80 in its footprint. So it's 1 unit per floor. And this is the historic building that it's sitting on top of. This is Steinway Hall, where Steinway pianos were made. Beautiful Warren and Wetmore building, the same architects that did Grand Central. And the as-of-right condition allowed us to build the building right up against the landmark, really obliterating it. And we made an argument, there's only one landmark that ever had a tower put on it, and that's Foster's Hearst building. And that was because it always had planned to have a tower on it, but the crash of '29 kept it from being built. So we went to landmarks and we said, let us build on top of the landmark, but we'll slide it back enough that it really celebrates the beautiful part of the building. And the building basically has an 85-foot required street wall, which becomes a big retail space connecting across. And then you've got the amenity spaces above. We're building some residents in the historic building, but then the tower goes up from there. And so here you can see as the new part comes down, we've allowed to turn the corner. This had all been damaged by a neighboring building, so we're turning all the limestone around the corner, making this bronze and glass facade. But then we thought about the building itself and the notion of the sort of Hugh Ferris diagram of the setback and why this is sort of so compelling in some ways. And so we said, okay, we could look at what everyone else has done, which is just make the setback the setback. We could do the sort of historical thing, which is the kind of traditional setback, or can we hyper-articulate the setback, a kind of feathering with 20 setbacks instead of 3. And then the building sits dead center on the park. So what we proposed to do was basically sort of make the living area facing the park, the sleeping area facing the city, and we put almost all the structure in the east and west walls. So these become these really, really thick walls with small punched openings, which completely opens this up to a 60-foot living room facing the park. And then when we thought about the materiality, we were very interested in the notion of taking the material that we love. This is Sullivan's only building in New York. Taking that, but using it in an absolutely cutting-edge new way, using new technology. And so we wanted to connect the facade. If the plan has something to do with the facade, we also wanted the facade to connect to the performance. So it became this idea of a super thick series of layers of terracotta and bronze on the side, and super open glass on the north and south, and that we would twist the terracotta shapes so that off each setback, as the sun comes from the south and hits the building, you get this moire pattern of light and shadow. And the building actually goes up to where it's only about 14 feet wide at the top. So if I ever thought I would use a French curve in my career, I would have said you were crazy. But we started thinking about these curvatures and what they could be. This is all obviously CNC milled for the formwork for the terracotta. But the terracotta shifts in and out so that you get those patterns of the shadow as it goes up. And there's a filigree of the bronze as it pulls the sort of thickened terracotta apart with the punched windows inside. And each pilaster is in and of itself one of the setbacks. These are some of the full-scale mock-ups. And then when you're on 57th Street, what the building will look like as it sort of just completely dissipates into the sky. So the top 200 feet of the building itself is just spire. It's just a glass and bronze sculpture. After you get past the tune mass damper, it literally is just a piece of art as it floats up there. And again, the park facade is really about maximizing the glazing, looking at the part with these bronze infills. Here's what it will look like from the north, from inside the park. To the city, it has a series of vertical bronze fins. And yes, we hope Sophia Loren buys an apartment there. And here you see the sort of tower top. So the last apartment is about here. This is mechanical equipment, and then the rest is just glass and steel. We're still working on the way that it lights up at night with these elements. We're working with L'Observatoire, doing the lighting in the terracotta itself and sort of at the bands as it goes up. And actually, at night, the shadows will reverse, and those will be lights hitting the terracotta when it moves up the building. And so here you see it from the park. So these are our 7 rules. And I think it's an incredible time to be a young architect. I think there's such a paradigm shift with technology, the way we're thinking about things, that there's so much research going on in practice. There's so much happening in that field. There are so many opportunities to build that even a decade or 2 decades ago would almost be unthinkable. I think that what we've really seen is I think that throughout the 20th century, many schools of architecture thought that sort of collaboration was a path towards mediocrity. But in fact, in an incredibly complex world, we see it as the only solution, the Avengers model, if you will. And, I think in this new millennium, there's a younger generation that's really thinking about collaboration in a different way and all different systems of using it and collaborating not only among architects or partners, but even the way we're thinking about building or making, politics, finance, technology, all of these things. You've got to reach out, you've got to connect with these things if you want to get buildings like that done. And I think that these new models of collaboration embody the complexity that we're facing right now, and they really begin to expose the problems that we're trying to solve in our city. And we can solve these problems without going down that sort of corporate formulaic thing. You can make these beautiful buildings. The most sustainable thing you could do is not put photovoltaics all over a building. You can make a building that people love and take care of, and they don't renovate it every 20 years. That's the most sustainable thing you could do. You can build density connected to mass transit so that's the most sustainable thing you can do. But if we're going to live in these dense cities, they better have a great quality of life. They better have great public space. They better be high quality buildings. And we've got to figure out ways to do that. Otherwise, it's really going to be a kind of miserable experience. So I'm incredibly proud to be an architect. I think our profession is amazing. I think it offers so many things for us to do if we're willing to take that risk. I think that we can truly make a difference in the world. I think you can be both and. I think you can take on the risk. I think you can take the chance. I think you can break the rules. And if you're willing to move beyond simply creating an image, you can have an incredible ride doing it. Thank you very much.